Hi, it's Bronwyn. Welcome back to Before Dieting. Today I want to talk about something that comes up regularly as a listener question. When I'm describing the Waiting for Happiness approach as systems thinking, some people assume that I'm talking about therapy. Others assume that I'm replacing therapy, and some assume it's just another psychological method but wearing a different label. It isn't. Systems thinking isn't therapy, and that distinction matters. Not because one is better than the other, but because they serve different purposes. Therapy in its many forms is designed to work with internal experience. Things like exploring your thoughts, processing emotion, regulating responses, and also building coping strategies. It addresses how you experience a problem and how you respond to it. Systems thinking does something different. It investigates the structure that's producing the problem in the first place. So it asks questions like, what are the conditions that are generating this outcome that you don't want? What are the patterns that keep repeating? And of course, what are the rules that are operating it? And a big part of systems thinking is looking at what are the feedback loops that are sustaining it. So going around that loop a number of times. So in short, systems thinking is really about diagnosing or being a diagnostic. Where therapy might ask, how does this make you feel? Systems thinking asks, what keeps this happening? If someone repeatedly regains weight, therapy may explore shame, perfectionism, attachment patterns, or trauma history, and all of that is definitely relevant. So systems thinking maps the structure. So how dieting might lead to relief eating, and how relief eating leads back to weight gain. And this is the loop. And what we're looking at is how does that loop repeat? But the loop that we're talking about is not an emotion, it is a structure. So systems thinking identifies that structure first. And once you can see the structure clearly, then therapy can work with it far more effectively. But without that structural map, therapy may stay focused on emotional processing while the underlying behavioural architecture remains unchanged. So I want you to think about systems thinking providing the diagnostic layer, and therapy that, if you do have therapy, can work with that understanding and go on and find those solutions that they actually offer specifically. Let's take an example of workplace burnout. Let's step away from the weight situation for a moment. Therapy might explore how people have trouble setting boundaries or feel under pressure to perform in the workplace, where systems thinking questions would ask things like, what expectations reward overwork, or what incentives escalate pressure? Or another one might be, what structures prevent recovery? If the environment rewards constant availability, emotional insight alone won't solve burnout. Another distinction that becomes particularly important when a problem keeps repeating, despite the fact that you might have insight into it, is that insight doesn't automatically alter the structure. You can understand your triggers and still be operating inside an unchanged behavioural loop. So systems thinking is concerned with the architecture of repetition, and therapy is concerned with how you experience that repetition. Now, if we bring it back to the weight regain situation, which is what this podcast is about, when someone says, why do I keep losing weight and putting it back on? The default assumption is it's often psychological or a willpower problem. We think maybe it's self-sabotage, or maybe it's low self-esteem. Maybe it's a discipline problem or a willpower problem. In therapy, you can process shame, you can explore early memories, you can build emotional tolerance. But if the eating system itself, the rules, the triggers, the restriction cycles, remains structurally intact, the outcome remains pretty predictable. Once the structure is visible, then therapy can support you. But without the diagnostic map, you're processing feelings inside a loop that hasn't been dismantled. And that's why the distinction really matters. Systems thinking isn't therapy. It's a structural diagnostic that explains why the problem keeps repeating. Therapy can deepen, stabilize, and support the shift. Used together, they can both address structure and experience, but used interchangeably, they become confused. When we're dealing with problems like weight regain that have been going on for years and sometimes decades, it's really important to have clarity about what it is that you need at the time. So systems thinking, as I said, is the diagnostic. It's the figuring out the structure and how that structure works on a repeated basis. And then if you want to take up therapy, you've got the right information to be able to bring to the therapist to actually say what it is that you need to work on. Before I go, I want to tell you a bit about what's coming next on Before Dieting. For the next 10 episodes, I'm going to be telling the stories of 10 women. They're not extreme stories. They're not about eating disorders, because that's not what we do here. They're just ordinary women who spent years trying to lose weight, those DIY dieters who take control over their eating in different ways through dieting. They don't believe they've got a psychological problem, and they certainly don't believe they've got an eating disorder. But one of the things that became very clear to me after speaking with so many women is the point of the last few episodes, and that is that most women don't look back far enough. They're usually looking at their most recent diet, most recent weight gain, and the recent attempts to get back on track, but they've never been able to solve the problem permanently. And this is where hearing other women's stories matters, because when you listen to someone else's story, you're not judging them in the same way that you judge yourself. You can see things more clearly because you are outside of the problem. You can notice patterns. You can have those moments of recognition without the usual rush of shame that shuts everything down for you. So each episode for the next 10 weeks is going to take one woman's story and unravel it completely. We're going to look at where the rules came from, how they formed their eating system, how it fell apart, and why the weight kept repeating. Now, the point of listening is not to copy someone else's solution, because you've already tried that with diets. But I want it to be able to show you that every woman's story is unique, including yours. But parts of your story exist in other women's lives. And when you can see those parts more clearly, it becomes possible to understand what's actually going on for you. For all of these women, the repeating weight pattern wasn't a food problem. It was a life problem with a long history. And that's what the season of these 10 episodes will be about. We want to make the invisible visible so you can finally start in the right place. Because when you're living inside the weight problem, it's a struggle that involves blind spots and blinkers. And that's why other women's stories matter, because hearing someone else's story is a mechanism to bypass some of that self-judgment. So listen in as we start these 10 episodes so you can learn about yourself through hearing other women's stories. Thanks for listening today. I look forward to speaking with you next week.